In the year 2000, a sonar scan near Alexandria found something that shouldn't have been there. Not a shipwreck, not a reef, a shape too large, too regular, too structured to be anything except what it turned out to be. A city, sitting 30 feet underwater, exactly where every modern map said there was nothing but open sea. For over 1,000 years, the place had a name that most people had only encountered in myth. The Egyptians called it Thonis. The Greeks called it Heraklion, after the hero Heracles, who was said to have first set foot in Egypt at this exact harbor. Herodotus wrote about it. Strabo placed it on a map. And for centuries, historians treated both accounts the same way you treat a folktale. Interesting, unverifiable, probably exaggerated. Then a French underwater archaeologist named Franck Goddio spent 4 years searching Aboukir Bay for the wreck of Napoleon's flagship and found something else entirely. What Goddio's team eventually mapped was not a scattered ruin. It was a functioning ancient port, frozen at the moment it went under. Streets, temple foundations, harbor basins, and an assemblage of ships and artifacts so large it would take 2 decades to even partially catalog. Here's what 20 years of excavation actually produced. Over 60 ancient vessels, ranging from small river craft to large seagoing ships, the largest single collection of ancient shipwrecks ever recovered from one location. More than 700 anchors, colossal red granite statues, some over 16 feet tall, roughly the height of a 2-story building, depicting Egyptian pharaohs and gods, not Greek or Roman figures. Gold jewelry, bronze ritual objects, and at the center of it all, the remains of the Grand Temple of Amun-Gereb, a major religious site that would have drawn pilgrims from across the eastern Mediterranean. To understand what 60-plus intact ships in a single location actually represents, it helps to think about what one ship cost. In the ancient Mediterranean, a large trading vessel meant years of skilled labor, imported timber, oak for the hull, pine for the mast, flax for the sails, and the coordinated expertise of shipwrights, riggers, and navigators. Losing a single ship was a significant economic event for whoever owned it. Finding one intact, centuries later, is already a major discovery on its own. Heraklion's harbor floor held over 60 of them, ranging from small Nile River craft to large seagoing vessels built for open Mediterranean crossings. And their construction techniques reflect multiple shipbuilding traditions layered on top of each other. Egyptian, Greek, and Phoenician methods, sometimes visible in the same hull. That mix is itself a kind of evidence. It shows a port where different maritime cultures weren't just passing through, but actively exchanging techniques, materials, and labor over generations. For a long time, there was a real scholarly problem sitting underneath all of this. Nobody could prove that Thonis and Heraklion were the same place. Ancient Egyptian sources talked about Thonis. Ancient Greek sources talked about Heraklion. Historians had debated for over a century whether these were 2 different cities, one city with 2 names, or one city that had been confused with another. Goddio's team settled it, not with a theory, but with an object. In 2001, divers recovered a black granodiorite stele, nearly 6 feet tall, standing almost exactly where it had been erected 23 centuries earlier. The inscription was a royal decree from Pharaoh Nectanebo I, dated to 380 BCE, laying out tax regulations for goods entering Egypt through the port. The decree names the location twice, once in Egyptian, as Thonis, and once in Greek, as Heraklion. Same stone, same decree, same city. A problem that had sat unresolved in Egyptology for over 100 years was closed by a single inscribed block of stone. That's not a small thing. Before this stele surfaced, if you'd written a paper claiming Thonis and Heraklion were interchangeable, you'd have needed to hedge every sentence. After it, the question simply stopped being a question, a debate that had run for over a century, closed by 23 lines of hieroglyphic and Greek text on a single slab of stone. But the identity of the city was always the easier problem. What happened to it is where the story most people have heard starts to fall apart under its own weight. Now here's where the official story usually gets told, and where it usually stops being told carefully. The standard explanation for why an entire city disappeared underwater is straightforward: earthquake, tsunami, sudden catastrophe. It's a clean narrative, it fits the drama of the discovery, and it's not entirely wrong. There is evidence of a seismic event in the region, but it's incomplete in a way that matters. Geologist Jane Danielle Stanley, working with the Smithsonian Institution, spent years studying the sediment layers beneath Abu Qir Bay, and his research points to something slower and less cinematic than a single catastrophic collapse. The ground beneath Thonis Heracleion was never solid rock. It was Nile Delta clay, soft, waterlogged, and structurally unstable, especially once you start building stone temples and colossal granite statues on top of it. Stanley's sediment analysis shows signs consistent with soil liquefaction. Heavy structures gradually causing the saturated clay beneath them to lose its load-bearing strength, sinking incrementally rather than all at once. Picture wet sand at the tide line, and how it turns almost liquid the moment you put real weight on it. Now scale that up to temple foundations carrying statues weighing several tons apiece. Add centuries of relative sea level rise in the Nile Delta, and you get a city that didn't fall so much as it slowly, unevenly gave way beneath its own weight. With localized collapses, possibly triggered or worsened by seismic activity, happening over an extended period rather than in one dramatic night. That distinction matters for a reason most retellings skip entirely. A single sudden catastrophe is a story about bad luck. A centuries-long structural failure, on unstable ground the Egyptians kept building on anyway, is a story about a civilization that understood the risk and built there regardless, because the location, at the mouth of the Nile's westernmost branch, was too economically valuable to abandon. Every merchant ship trading with Egypt from Greece, Phoenicia, or Carthage had to pass through this port. That's not a footnote. That's the entire reason the city existed exactly where the ground couldn't fully support it. Stay with that for a second, because it reframes everything that comes next. This wasn't a city caught off guard. It was a city built on a calculated trade-off, for over 1,000 years, until the trade-off finally lost. The scale of what survived the collapse is still hard to process. When a building sinks gradually into clay sediment rather than being violently destroyed, it tends to get buried rather than scattered. That's why divers found statues lying in the positions they fell, ships still holding cargo, temple offerings undisturbed in place. The sediment that swallowed the city also sealed it, which is part of why the excavation has produced such an unusually complete picture of a working Egyptian port at the height of its activity. Not a curated museum reconstruction, but the actual, undisturbed floor of a functioning ancient economy. And there's a part of this story that gets flattened in most popular retellings. The framing tends to emphasize the Greek connections, the Greek name, the Greek merchant ships, the god Heracles. That's accurate, but it's half the picture. The city that sank was not a Greek outpost that happened to sit in Egypt. It was an Egyptian city, administered by Egyptians, built around Egyptian religious tradition that had already been continuous in the Nile Valley for 3,000 years before a single Greek trading ship ever entered its harbor. The statues are Egyptian gods and Egyptian rulers, carved in an Egyptian artistic tradition. The Greeks who passed through were guests in someone else's economy, subject to someone else's tax law, which is precisely what that granodiorite stele records. Here's what's still unresolved, and this is the part worth sitting with. Stay with us for this last part, because it's the piece that actually keeps this an open case rather than a closed one. After 2 decades of work, archaeologists estimate that less than half of the site has been systematically excavated. Sonar and magnetometer surveys have identified sections of the bay where structures appear to exist beneath the sediment, but haven't been formally investigated. Some of those readings don't cleanly match the layout of the areas that have already been mapped, which is precisely the kind of discrepancy that drives further seasons of fieldwork, rather than settling anything. Oxford's Damien Robinson, who has co-directed research on the site's broader context, has been clear that plenty of the site's chronology, how far back continuous occupation at this exact location actually goes, is still being worked out through ongoing fieldwork, not settled fact. Every excavation season adds detail that either confirms or complicates the existing timeline, and there's no guarantee which direction the next one goes. That's not a cliffhanger inserted for effect. It's the actual, current state of the research. A team spent 20 years excavating a fraction of a submerged city, and is still working through what the rest of it contains. So here's what we're actually left with. A port that operated at the center of Mediterranean trade for over 1,000 years. A city whose identity was locked in scholarly limbo for over a century, until one inscribed stone settled it in a single reading. A collapse that wasn't a single dramatic night, but a slow structural failure the Egyptians appear to have tolerated for centuries because the location was worth the risk. And a site where more than half of what's actually down there in Abu Qir Bay hasn't been looked at yet. What's striking isn't any one of these facts on its own. It's that each one, the identity question, the collapse mechanism, the incomplete excavation, got simplified into a cleaner, more dramatic version somewhere between the archaeological record and the popular retelling. A century-long identity dispute becomes a footnote. A slow structural failure spanning centuries becomes a single tsunami. A site that's still less than half mapped gets presented as a finished discovery with a tidy ending. The real story is slower, more specific, and in some ways more unsettling than the simplified one, because it's not about a single moment of disaster. It's about how much of a civilization's history can sit fully preserved and completely inaccessible, 30 feet down, for over 1,000 years, while the world above builds itself into the modern era without knowing it's there, and how much of it, even now, is still sitting exactly where nobody has gone to look yet. If you had to guess what's sitting in that other half of the site, structures nobody has excavated yet, what do you think it changes about how we understand this place? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one of them. If you want to go further, we've put together a complete guide covering 50 ancient discoveries that science still hasn't fully explained. Every site, every mystery, every competing theory, with sources. Link is in the description. And if today's video was useful, subscribe. We publish a new ancient mystery every week.